Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. We opened up the webinar and we are watching people file in, but we were going to get started just because I know it's a really, really busy time for so many people, and hopefully persons will join us during the actual webinar as we go ahead. Welcome to everyone. My name is Dr. Jani Vremi, and I am the director of the Sridhar Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services here in beautiful Barbados at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus. I'd like to officially welcome you to this, the third and final installment of our webinar series in furtherance of an arrangement between the Sridhar Rampal Center and the U.S. Embassy in Barbados to promote US-CARICOM trade and investment relations. We are joined in this component of that arrangement by the Caribbean Policy Consortium, CPC, with whom we enjoy a close and very fruitful relationship. We have been generously provided with funding to launch a series of these activities encompassing university exchanges with the US, research and opportunities for our students, as well as webinars and thought exchange fora like this, which we hope will help guide and spearhead thinking for the CARICOM region on how to advance the economic and investment component of US-CARICOM relations. This is a particularly important time for these relations, especially against the background of current geopolitics. It's a very topical discussion how we should structure that relationship with the past Summit of the Americas in June taking place, and with a lot of ventures and ideas at the forefront of persons' minds in how exactly we should traverse this relationship with one of our oldest and most important trading and investment partners. If you recall, the first webinar, which we held in December last year, focused on identifying the specific entities in the US with responsibility for trade and investment relations between CARICOM and the US. The second, earlier this year, looked at tangible opportunities in the private sector, a transactional focus for these relations to blossom. And this one, we're going to some fundamentals. How do we structure? What are the architectural predicates we need to build a relationship between the US and CARICOM? This webinar, which we entitle Using the TIC as a Tool, looks specifically at US-CARICOM trade and investment relations that can take place under the pre-existing Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, the TIFA, which was signed in 2013, and possibly can be used as a basis to promote a more focused approach to developing the relationship with the United States. We have invited presenters from Latin America, in particular Costa Rica, as well as Uruguay. And in the case of the latter, Uruguay, because they were particularly successful in using the TIFA as a basis for increasing their bilateral trade and investment with the United States. The format of this webinar will follow that of the two previous webinars with one important deviation. We have a short but important keynote address by the DDG, Deputy Director General of the WTO, Ms. Annabel Gonzalez, who will tell us about her personal and professional experience navigating Costa Rica's relationship with our big neighbor from the north. After Annabel Gonzalez gives her keynote, we will then turn to our two presenters who have fashioned a briefing paper that will guide this discussion on how Uruguay navigated its relations with the US through the negotiation of a TIFA, what are lessons that were learned and possibly can be imparted to CARICOM, This briefing paper will be distributed to all of you who have signed up once it is finalized. That presentation will be followed by a sort of a discussion among our 4 speakers who I will introduce at the allocated time. I will introduce all of our speakers at the allocated time when they will present. We ask that as you listen, that you present any questions you have in the Q&A tab, which we will hopefully get to, and the last 10 to 15 minutes in the dedicated Q&A session. Without further ado then, let me welcome as our keynote, Ms. Annabelle Gonzalez. As I mentioned, she is the Deputy Director General at the WTO, and she has served in that capacity since 2021. She's a renowned global expert on trade, investment, and economic development, having previously served as Minister of Trade of Costa Rica, Senior Director at the World Bank's Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice, and Director of the WTO Agriculture Division. It's really, really great to have you here, Annabelle, to talk to us, not so much as your experience as a WTO expert, but really as a country expert in navigating this relationship that you so successfully helped Costa Rica court with the United States. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Janit, for this opportunity, and good morning to everyone. Good afternoon. I am delighted to have been invited to kickstart this conversation on leveraging the US-CARICOM Trade and Investment Council to support increased trade and investment, and to do so in the company of so many good friends and colleagues from the region. So when Janice reached out, she asked me to share with you the experience of my home country, Costa Rica, in negotiating with the US on trade and investment. So I guess this remarks could be titled From One Small Economy to Other Smaller Economies, Maximizing and Building on Bilateral Frameworks to Spur Trade and Investment. And as this implies going back to my pre-WTO life, I will be speaking on my personal capacity and in no way represent the institution I work for right now. So while each bilateral economic relation is different, looking at the experience of countries of comparable size and level of development can provide some insights which may be relevant in strengthening and re-energizing existing mechanisms. And I would like to highlight 3 similarities between Costa Rica, and I would say Central America more broadly, and CARICOM countries, which underpin the relationship with the US. First and foremost, trade and investment matters for us. It is hard to think about a successful growth and development path for CARICOM or for Central American countries in the absence of integration into global markets. Exports and imports, as well as foreign direct investment, are key for growth, diversification, job creation, and know-how and technology transfer. Second, the US is our most important trading partner because geography matters. In the case of Costa Rica, 40% of merchandise trade is with the US. The US is also the top market for Costa Rica's exports of digital services trade, the main source market for tourism, the main foreign investor in the country, and it also holds the largest stock of FDI. And third, it falls on us to proactively drive the trade and investment relationship with the US. While the US is a key economic partner for CARICOM and for Costa Rica, these countries are relatively junior trade partners for the US. Costa Rica, for example, is the 42nd largest goods trading partner. Of course, other elements, from democracy to migration, from security to energy and more, provide a strategic dimension to the trade and investment relationship and puts it in a broader context. Now, taking the initiative is key to expand and strengthen such a partnership, and I will come back to this point later on. Now, as in the case of CARICOM countries, Costa Rica was a beneficiary of the Caribbean Basin Initiative since its enactment almost 4 decades ago. The preferential scheme was instrumental in helping to attract FDI in apparel and textiles, as well as in the development of non-traditional agricultural products like cut flowers, melons, papayas, and others, both of which were initial steps in diversifying the production and trade structure of Costa Rica. In the early years, a US-Costa Rica Trade and Investment Council was the main mechanism to manage the bilateral relationship. The council met once a year at the senior officials level, mostly to take stock of trade and investment flows, identify opportunities for expanding trade, discuss specific trade concerns, and remove bottlenecks. For Costa Rica, priorities at the time included, for example, SPS measures applied by the US to imports of tropical plants, mangoes, papayas, and others. For the US, concerns often related to intellectual property or investment issues. Now, to give you an idea, and I will come to this at several points in my remarks, in 1985, bilateral trade US-Costa Rica in goods amounted to less than $1 billion US dollars. Now, things changed in the early 1990s when the US engaged in the NAFTA negotiations with Mexico and Canada. Even before the agreement was concluded, Costa Rica and the rest of the Central American countries began to express their concern to the US that an FTA with Mexico would negatively impact the region through erosion of preferential market access and deviation of investment, particularly in the textile and apparel sector. It was 1992. And at that time, Costa Rica bilateral trading goods with the US had increased to 2.8 billion. Now, talks about parity with NAFTA for CBI countries, supported by friends in the administration, Congress, and the private sector, ultimately partially materialized in improved market access conditions via the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act of the year 2000. And there are several of you who are in this call. I can certainly think of David Lewis and Wade McCook, all of which were instrumental in passage of CVTPA and other initiatives. Now, Central American countries at the time were also expectant that the negotiations of the Free Trade Area of the Americas, which had been launched in 1994, would deliver an agreement, which, as we know, did not. Now, in early 2001, Central American presidents proposed to the US yet again their interest in negotiating an FTA, concerned about some of CVTPA's constraints, but most importantly, by the launch of negotiations between the US and Chile. For the first time in almost a decade, the region found a partner willing to explore the idea. Intensive technical discussions began in September 2001 at a very detailed level, which allowed parties to increase their understanding and exchange views on what a potential FTA would entail. On January 16, 2002, then President Bush announced his intention to explore an FTA with Central America. After signing the Trade Act of 2002, which included Trade Promotion Authority, President Bush formally notified Congress of his intention to negotiate a US-Central America Free Trade Agreement. At that time, bilateral US goods trade had reached 6.2 billion. So remember, from 1 billion to 2.8 billion to 6.2 billion at the time. Now, CAFTA negotiations were launched in January 2003 and concluded after 9 formal rounds of negotiations and countless other meetings in December 2003 for the other Central American countries. Costa Rica separated from the group and continued to negotiate with the US 2 issues that were controversial for Costa Rica: the opening of the telecom and insurance state monopolies. A couple of months later, the US and Costa Rica finalized negotiations, and all parties, including the Dominican Republic, which had joined the negotiations halfway, signed the agreement in August 2004. CAFTA negotiations were not easy for Costa Rica. I was the chief negotiator for Costa Rica at the time. It was not easy for the other Central American countries either. Power asymmetries, the complexity and extension of the topics covered in the agreement, and the multi-dimensional nature of the negotiations, including negotiations among Central American governments who were not organized in a regional negotiating machinery, made for very tough negotiations. Now, CAFTA-DR came into force in 2006 for the US, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. In 2007 for the Dominican Republic, and in 2009 for Costa Rica, after a complicated domestic approval process, which included the first and only referendum in the country's history. Now, CAFTA-DR has been a success story for Costa Rica. Bilateral two-way trade between the US and Costa Rica has increased significantly to reach almost 14 billion last year. Exports of goods have diversified and become increasingly sophisticated, led by medical instruments, tropical products, integrated circuits, and orthopedic appliances, while services exports, including digitally traded services, are now on par in value with goods exports. Imports have improved competitiveness and reduced prices, while the opening of the telecom sector has resulted in increased mobile internet penetration and product variety, as well as reduced rates, and has been a key pillar of the development of the digital services industry in the country. Let me conclude with 3 thoughts on how to leverage bilateral frameworks to spur trade integration from one small economy to other small economies. First, leadership and proactive engagement are key. Regular scheduling of meetings and strong participation in agenda setting can keep the forum active and relevant. Clear vision, focused objectives, and technical preparation are necessary to maximize existing mechanisms. Meetings are to be high points of a continuous engagement process. Second, concrete deliverables are important for the mechanism to be effective. Inputs from the private sector provide guidance on opportunities for trade and investment expansion and facilitation. Sorting out trade irritants before they escalate can help manage their relationship in a productive way. Participation from relevant government agencies can contribute to meaningful discussions. And third, expand beyond the bilateral dimension to explore what's going on in other fora. What's new? What's happening that may be of relevance? Right now, for instance, I find very interesting that the US and Kenya have announced a new trade initiative to negotiate high standard commitments in areas like digital trade, agriculture, small and medium-sized businesses, labor, and environment. It would be good for CARICOM, in my view, to know more about this and other initiatives. It is always good to keep an eye on the competition, quote, end quote, but it can also provide ideas on how to move the US-CARICOM trade and investment relationship to the next level. Thank you very much, Janit, for the invitation.
Wow, that was an excellent, I think we can all go home now. That was such a comprehensive and excellent, both personal as well as a very kind of sobering, objective view. I'm sure there were some difficulties that were encountered along the way. I think you touched on them, but overwhelmingly the experience seems to have been complex but fruitful. And I think hearing them from you and your 3 last points, which I need not repeat, are sort of really great ways for us to think about the relationship that CARICOM can begin developing with the US or continue developing with the US. I know, DDG, that you may have to to leave at some point, but this was an excellent start, and I want to thank you so much for your words. Appreciation is also coming from the audience, so thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Excellent. So we're going to really move swiftly to our next speakers, who did the hard work, I think, in advance of this webinar to, like Annabelle did, think about the experience that Uruguay, maybe a country we hear about less, but certainly is punching beyond its weight in terms of what it has managed to do, using, again, the Trade and Investment Council, the TIC. And that's one of the things we heard from Annabelle, that it really started with regular meetings under the TIC that then escalated to what was ultimately the CAFTA-DR. Let me, without further ado, introduce our presenters of the paper. First of all, let me welcome Ms. Dr. Herrera Munoz, who is an expert consultant and international business manager. She has a doctorate in international business, master's in organizational management, and founder of COEX Corporation and the Latin American Network of Conferences. And she also does some mentorship in operational, strategic, and consulting in international trade and imports and exports, processes in Colombia, Latin America, and Asia. And her co-presenter and co-writer of that paper that we will distribute subsequently is Ana Claudia Moran, herself from Uruguay, who has a degree in international business relations and foreign trade. And she's a consultant for national and international organizations in foreign trade and SMEs and logistics, and a director of IBA, International Business, in Uruguay, and she works in Uruguay and Spain. So I know they've arranged how they're going to present. I'll first turn the floor briefly to Angelica, and then I suspect she's going to introduce the paper and then turn over to Anna. So over to you, Angelica.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be part of the panel guests in this webinar. I invite those who joins to be attentive to this available topic. And let me introduce to Ana Moran from Uruguay, who present the summary, our paper right for this topic, very important in this moment for foreign trade and international commerce.
Thank you. Thank you, Shanice. Thank you, Angelica. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this so professional and quite interesting panel. I would like to thank today to my colleague, Angelica, for her invitation to be part of this topic with her, and also to the organizers who have relied on our trajectory for the presentation of today. Well, in order to be efficient with the time allotted, I have divided the presentation into 4 points, similar that Annabella. We consider these 4 points are the fundamental ones for the best attention of different issues. So in first instance, I would like to share with you the process and the organization of the stakeholders during the negotiation of the TIFA between Uruguay and United States. Secondly, the results and the success that this framework agreement means for Uruguay, the challenges faced by Uruguay in this regard, and finally, some lessons we would like to share with you that we understand will be very interesting for CARICOM experience. So talking about the process and the organization about the stakeholders during the TIFA negotiation, well, we would like to contextualize the situation, and we consider the process began during the government period between 2000 and 2005. In Uruguay, the president was Mr. Jorge Valle, and it's important to remember that during 2001, the Argentinian crisis had strong economic consequences for Uruguay, And in 2002, Uruguay itself faced a strong blow to its foreign trade due to foot and mouth disease, affecting almost 100 of its meat exports, being the commodity the number one in the Uruguayan exportable supply. Of course, this crisis was the consequence of the Argentinian crisis in a direct way that affect our country. In this context, of course, the urgency to diversify and to open new markets led to the negotiation of a free trade agreement between Uruguay and the United States. Thus, representatives of various private, commercial, industrial sector, industrial chambers, chambers of commerce, trade unions, ministries, government and opposition politicians, professionals, and operators in general were summoned, and 11 commissions were formed to prepare reports and SWOT analysis of the various scenarios that this agreement could present for Uruguay. Without no doubts, their contributions were of vital importance when assessing the next steps to be taken. At this time, the president of Uruguay was Mr. Tabaré Vázquez. We are talking about the period 2005-2010, and he will be the one who will continue with the management of the free trade agreement. The conclusions of those commissions allowed to detect important interesting spaces for the development of a trade between both countries, both based in goods and also in knowledge-based services. However, there was also some concerns and doubts about the viability of the agreement, which were defining and can be based in two important or specific points. Uruguay was going through the first 10 years of the regional integration as member of the Mercosur, in fact, the best 10 years of the bloc. The importance of this agreement in quantitative terms for the country's foreign trade was fundamental. The fear in that moment of the lack of approval by some of the partners generates considerable doubts in many actors due to the magnitude of the agreement with North America and the possible consequences of this action within the bloc, thus revealing an explicit interest in prioritizing trade integration in the region. On the other hand, different sectors point out the risk that by including in this agreement last generation issues such as intellectual property, global services, government procurement, the spaces for national policies focused on development would be reduced. That is just the fear of the competition from large American companies as opposed to local ones, a point that was specifically mentioned and remarked by several actors here in Uruguay. These doubts and their foundations, together with internal and international policy changes that took place during 2006 within the parliament in the United States, led to the signing of the free trade agreement becoming ineffective. However, and due to the willingness of both parties to find spaces for closer ties, the TIFA was proposed, considered by many actors here in Uruguay as the result of a non-negotiation way, and was signed in 2007. If we have to talk now about outcomes that link the TIFA with the overall success, we can mention that regardless of how we arrived at the signing of the TIFA, we can certainly say that within this framework, trade between the two countries has become more dynamic. Even though not all the annual meetings of the Trade and Investment Council, the TIC, have been held, it has been possible to maintain updated framework that takes into account the issues and dynamics of current international trade. If we talk about the goods, well, Uruguay's exports of goods grow 262% in real terms between 2008 and 2020, based on cellulose, meat, dairy products, beverage concentrators, wool, rice, among others. This has had impact in terms of boosting the industry and consequently on employment. Talking about the services, similarly happened. The development of global service exports between 2008 and 2020 show an increase of 156%. If we do not consider the year 2020, this increase will rise to 231%. taking into consideration that this particular year was one of a strong decline of the services in general and the tourism in particular. Specific cases on the development of technology issues are also mentioned as an example that our country did improve in order to accelerate this integration and be part active of the agreement. For example, the creation of a single window for foreign trade that through digitalization facilitates commercial operations and boosts e-commerce. The import exemption regime that is applying up to today currently allow up to 3 online purchases per year for a maximum of 200 each and a relation of up to 20 kilograms each. Furthermore, goods and services, it is important to remark the increase of the investment, the direct investment that United States companies perform here in Uruguay. So strictly speaking of direct investment, the United States today occupies the first place of investor in the Uruguay market with a participation of the 48%. These figures are talking about 2021 years official statistics. So let's talk about challenges faced by Uruguay during this period. And we can remark some challenges that we have faced, but also ones that are still in force, so pending issues to remark and to deepen. For example, we can highlight the internal point of view that our country and the actors, that the stakeholders, have to manage internal in the country, the challenge of balancing all the voices to reach the acceptance of signing of a framework agreement with public and private actors, and even with opposition within the government. Also, was important to align with innovation and adding technology to facilitate process, as mentioned, for example, in the new window for foreign trade. Also, talking about the pending issues, the challenges that we had to, for example, to deepen on the facilities for business according to the protocols that continue to be proposed, improve the spaces for participation and management for small and medium enterprises, deepen in good practices in trade, modernizing the business environment, develop more and better e-commerce tools, work on standardization and homologation of procedures that facilitate commercial exchange must be very, very important. And we, as a country, focused so much during the last meeting of the TIC, because of the importance of the small companies in our country and all in the region, improve international and interinstitutional information exchange as a security mechanism in all the processes contained in the framework agreement, and promoting the good management of public information and its correct application. Of course, during this procedure that was taking about 4 or 5 years for Uruguay, we obtained several lessons. Some of them we understand would be of great reference for CARICOM, also for performing the same way or just for taking advantage and going to another way. So let me say that based on the ones learned from the Uruguayan case and considering how they can contribute to the CARICOM experience, it is important to highlight the essential that is essential to recognize and identify the asymmetry spaces of the actors in the negotiation. I think something similar that Annabella manifests in her speech. In the case of Uruguay, we are a small country negotiating with a large and developed nation. In the case of CARICOM, it is a group of integrated nations negotiating with a developed nation also. Keeping this difference in mind allows us to focus clearly on the objectives to be achieved and not get distracted or miss opportunities when defining them. The importance of the role of the private sector as an articulator of the management from a strategic and daily point of view, which allows it to propose from the practical vision of the management, is another must that should be considered when you decide to negotiate a TIFA. The interinstitutional coordination that allows public and private feedback, where the private sector in many opportunities give dynamism, speed, and innovation to the public management, also is highlighted by our paper, by our work. Value the opportunity to diversify the productive matrix and propose new growth strategy that focus particularly on small and medium enterprises and their impact on society. For example, employment, gender equality, environmental care, development of knowledge-based services, among others. Last but not least, we would like to remark that the trade agenda of transactional value is to focus on electronic commerce and B2B initiatives at an international level, finding the right mechanism for each market, its strategic partners, and with proper strategic planning makes commercial development and growth viable. And hand in hand with this, the spillover to the national business fabric is a certainty. When this happens, we empower societies, and it is from this place that the framework of trade agreements must be evaluated. There are not single recipes, there are tailor-made recipes. The key for our countries is to dare to find them based on the concept that integration in any form is the path to success. Thank you so much for your attention.
Wow, Anna, thank you so much for that presentation. I know that it's a joint thought process that you and Angelica kind of developed, but you executed it very well. And I know you probably practiced very much, because I know English is not your first language, but you did an excellent job. So really, really well done. Another clap coming up from the audience. I think we have such a great basis for the discussion that's now going to ensue. And we have about 50 minutes. I've been very, very, very strict with our next speakers to keep their discussions between 7 and 10 minutes so that we can really get any input from the audience and generate a great discussion. Before I turn to these discussants, let me just say what I've actually gathered from the first two presentations. One is that there is some commonality in sort of the basics and the predicates of the experience that we're going to compare to CARICOM. They're small by any definition. Costa Rica and Uruguay are small, negotiating a sort of an arrangement with the biggest trade partner in the same hemisphere, the United States. But from there, I think a lot of the similarities begin to dissipate. In the case of Uruguay, they have retained the TIC and the TIFA as the basis for establishing and promoting their relations with the US. And that has seemed to be an effective tool, whether we say it's causation or correlation. They have given us amazing numbers of 260% increases in goods and services trade. And in the case we heard of Costa Rica, we really know that they negotiated through a more regional setting, through the CAFTA, and they actually escalated their relationship to a full-blown FTA. So that's also a point of difference. We also know that when the negotiations were taking place for both Costa Rica and Uruguay, the FTA was the model. And although, as I mentioned, there were different stages of the spectrum, that approach to liberalization and open markets was still sort of the ideological model of the time. Now, as Annabelle said, there are new models. Kenya, what it's doing with the US, looking at labor standards, looking at digitization, MSMEs as sort of the engines also of these negotiations, and more structural transformation of economies is something that may challenge the old model of how we negotiate. And obviously at CARICOM, we are operating as a bloc, and we have certain regional obligations to each other as predicates to these overall negotiations with the US. Another point of difference, obviously, to bear in mind is this, the state of our economies. What are the sectors that are driving growth in our economies, and even using the regional sort of arrangement as a playground before we can even negotiate with our bigger neighbors to the north. So quite a lot of similarities, very different outcomes, and quite a very different, international ecosystem within which these negotiations will take place. So with that sort of background in mind, let me introduce our discussants. And we have, I think, the best possible list of speakers that we could canvass. Let me introduce first Ambassador Wayne McCook, who is the Assistant Secretary General of the CARICOM Single Market and Trade, the CSMT, at the Caribbean Community Secretariat. In his former life, he has served as Jamaica's ambassador to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva, including at the WTO, and ambassador to the People's Republic of China. So a really great person to have on this panel, not just because of his present role, but the antithesis in terms of, not antithesis, the antecedent in terms of what he did before. Let me also welcome Mr. Braden Young. He is the Director for Mexico and the Caribbean at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. He is responsible for developing, coordinating, and implementing U.S. trade and investment policy in this region, and has previously served as Commercial Officer and Regional Standards Attaché based in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. So again, a key insight here, both in terms of his experience in Latin America and now looking more wholesomely at the relationship with the Caribbean. Our third speaker is Ms. Andrea Ewart, who is a Jamaican national, US trained and international trade attorney with her own firm, Develop Trade Law, LLC, which works with businesses, governments, and individuals to facilitate the successful movement of goods and services across national borders. And I should say that as part of the US SRC engagement, Ms. Ewart has also penned a paper that we will be releasing soon on how the private sector can be used to further the relations with the CARICOM. So that we have a great piece of work, and we will release it soon. And finally, but obviously not least, Mr. David Lewis is a fellow, as am I and Andrea, with the Caribbean Policy Consortium, Vice President of Manchester Trade, an international business advisory firm working on all Caribbean trade and investment and economic integration agreements from the CBI to the present. And I must say that the thought of bringing in Uruguay as a comparator is really the brainchild of David, who has always thought of the private sector and the comparative experiences as really a great way of propelling Caribbean-US relations. So without further ado, and I'm going to keep them to time, let me ask Ambassador McCook to please give his thoughts on the TIC as a tool and any other thoughts and insights he might want to share on how we drive this process with the US. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Genevieve, and thank you, Anna, for the presentation. Colleagues, I want to probably go straight into setting context for the CARICOM US Trade and Investment Engagement and anticipate a more critical dialogue coming from colleagues like Andrea and David, who might look at it in a broader dimension. One of the things that I think I would say before going into the outline is the two presentations, Annabelle's and Anna's, strike a bit of a contrast in that you have two comparators who approach size by taking an offensive approach to trade. One could argue that CARICOM has approached its size issue by taking a defensive approach to trade. And I'd put that aside as a contextual a reference point perhaps for further discussion. But to the relationship, the US-CARICOM relationship is strategic and important at all levels. The bases for bilateral engagement and community engagement with the US are quite extensive. The region has significant diplomatic presence in Washington, and the US has significant diplomatic presence in the region. What that means is that there's constant interface and interaction at member state level with the United States, reflective of the depth and breadth of the relationship of each member state with the United States and the community as a whole with the US. Right now, the engagement between the community and the US is heavily focused on work emanating from the summit between the heads of government of CARICOM plus the DR and the President and Vice President of the USA at the recent Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles. This work is focused on 3 CARICOM US committees on energy security, food security, and finance. There is already active engagement and serious work underway on these 3 tracks. The US 2020 Strategy for Engagement in the Caribbean also aims to increase engagement with the governments of the region, with civil society and private sector, and identify certain priorities in that engagement. The momentum in the summit-driven process that I mentioned earlier and related processes augur well for ongoing work in several areas, including in particular structured frameworks like the TIC. In fact, the carefully selected areas of focus arising out of the summit, energy, food security, and finance, could be complemented by and complement work in the context of a TIC guided by the objectives of the TIFA. The US is by far CARICOM's most important trading partner, with trade in 2018 valued at $35.3 billion, of course, with a $12.3 billion US trade surplus. The framework for trade relations between the US and CARICOM includes the network of preferential arrangements in the CBI, that is CIBERA and CBTPA. These facilitate trade in goods and agriculture across a wide range of products. Of course, we had discussion of Uruguay and Costa Rica's reaction to the setback in the negotiation of the FTA and the 2 tracks that were taken, one to proceed to an FTA, the other to embark on a TIFA, that is Uruguay. CARICOM and the US perhaps pursued the second approach in the post-FTA environment by moving to a TIFA. And the TIFA, which was signed in 2013, has an elaborate set of objectives outlined in it. The TIC, which was established, Trade and Investment Council, which was established in 1991, was revitalized in 2006. And of course, the timing is significant, and it correlates with discussions earlier about what happened in the wake of the denouement of the FTA. And the Council is responsible inter alia for monitoring trade and investment relations between the parties, identifying and facilitating opportunities for expanding trade in products and services and investment, considering specific trade and investment matters of interest to the parties, and identifying and working to remove impediments to trade and investment between the parties. All of these are issues that would have been touched on in both the presentations that are guiding us this morning. The 2 sides last met at the 8th meeting of the TIC in June 2019 in Miami, and that meeting addressed inter alia the status of beneficiary treatment under the CBI, as there are a number of CARICOM member states that are not now beneficiaries, and they have expressed an interest in being included, but that has not so far been advanced. Possible work on trade and services, IP cooperation, and work towards launching a joint expert group on ICT. We know the story that follows. The agendas of almost all bilateral strategic engagement would have been adjusted for the realities of COVID. So there have been no follow-up meetings of the TIC since we entered into what I describe as a crisis period of 2019, which is not yet through. And nevertheless, there have been conversations about re-engaging the TIC beginning in 2021. And those conversations continue with an eye towards an early convening of the TIC as soon as circumstances allow. Now, that will require, of course, serious preparation in terms of member state engagement, looking at the agenda that is foreshadowed in the TIFA for the work of the TIC, looking at the outcomes of the Miami meeting and the follow-up activities. In each area, work had begun but was not completed because, of course, all our member states had been completely caught up in addressing the crisis that we all faced. It is true to say the TIFA and the TIC have been underutilized as a framework for dialogue and advancing trade and investment cooperation. We are hopeful that the post-summit process of intensive engagement in focused areas that I mentioned will catalyze re-engagement in the trade and investment area through the TIC and the TIFA, and we can discuss some more about what that might look like as we progress.
Yes, Ambassador, 1 minute if I can.
Okay, so I go to my last observation, which is to look at the lessons from the Uruguay study. The Uruguay experience shows a correlation between the TIFA and enhanced trade performance with the US. However, given Uruguay's historical posture as a trade offensively focused nation, a member of the Cairns Group, a giant in agriculture, its approach to trade is decidedly different from that of the Caribbean and in a historical context. Not to say that they are not examples that CARICOM should take on board, but we need to start off by saying that they're very different postures on trade in Uruguay and in the Caribbean. So its experience, while exemplary, would not present a plug-and-play blueprint for CARICOM. I also would note that as a single state, the agility in its engagement would be decidedly different from that of a community of sovereign states, which is what CARICOM would represent. So one could also attribute the Uruguay success to its focus on supply side and competitiveness supply side and competitiveness agenda. To first ensure that it had the capability to drive market performance by productivity and then use the mechanism to support that. CARICOM is now embarked on a decisive effort in agriculture and contemplating a similar approach to industrial production. If these two initiatives on the supply side achieve the success we hope, then it could present a basis for using the TIFA and related trade arrangements to drive competitive and positive growth and performance. Thank you very much.
Another excellent inning. Thank you so much, Ambassador. That was great to set context, point out differences, point out the offensive defense, another clap coming up from the audience, posture, wondering whether it's time to change that posture. But I'm sure I'm going to hear from Andrea and David on these, and don't be afraid to be controversial and to push Ambassador McCook on some of the points he's raised. But let's hear first from our director at the USCR on Caribbean relations. And over to you, Braden. I'm going to keep you to 7 to 8 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks, Jan, and thanks to you and the Shootout Rampal Center for this invitation. I'm really excited to be a part of this great panel. Just to double check, you can hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. Ambassador McCook, I'm particularly honored to join you on this panel. Ambassador McCook and I spoke earlier this week and shared some ideas about today's discussion and most importantly, our commercial relationship. I'd like to also thank my colleagues at the U.S. Embassy in Bridgetown for helping make today's event possible. I recently served at our embassy in Mexico City and have a special appreciation for everything that our foreign service colleagues do. And having only recently started at USTR, I'm new to this portfolio, and so this is a perfect opportunity to meet you all, albeit virtually, and hear your perspectives on US-CARICOM trade and investment. And it is my sincere hope to have the chance to meet many of you in person sometime in the near future. This past June, United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai underscored the importance of our relationship with the Caribbean as our neighbor and third border. The United States is fortunate to enjoy such strong cultural and commercial ties with Caribbean nations. However, we found, countries across the region are a real important part of our broader trade agenda. At USTR, we are focused on developing and implementing an inclusive, worker-centric trade policy. Trade must advance the rights of workers, drive trade growth, and lead to better economic outcomes for all. In addition, our trade agenda includes implementation of strong environmental standards that are critical to sustainable growth and addressing the challenges posed by climate change. And we are committed to a trade agenda that advances racial and gender equality and supports underserved communities. I believe these principles reflect values that we share, and our joint effort should demonstrate a commitment to these shared goals. A Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, or TIFA, is a broad framework for dialogue and trade and investment issues. TIFAs are not free trade agreements, of course, but they do provide opportunities for constructive discussions to identify opportunities and address challenges, with the goal of expanding trade and creating more attractive investment climates. Our TIFA with members of CARICOM is unique in that it is plurilateral, unlike our other bilateral TIFAs. And the size of this grouping, as well as the great diversity among our CARICOM members, presents certain challenges. And even organizing a council meeting is quite an undertaking. The last time, as the ambassador pointed out, that we convened a US-CARICOM meeting was in 2019 in Miami. Of course, that was the last year before the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted all of our lives, but has hit Latin America and the Caribbean particularly hard. I'd like to close, and now as we slowly return to normal, we welcome the opportunity to engage with members of the Caribbean diaspora and our Caribbean trading partners as we consider next steps and the future of US-Caribbean trade relations. I want to close by thanking Angelica and Anna for their report. A very important part of our work on trade policy is understanding stakeholders' views and perspectives and learning from their experiences. Hearing your ideas and learning from you is a critical part of the process. The report does a good job describing the strong growth in trade between the United States and Uruguay, and offers some interesting perspectives on our bilateral TIFA and our broader trade relationship, and some interesting ideas for the US-CARICOM commercial relationship. As the report itself acknowledges, the Uruguay TIFA and the CARICOM TIFA are different, and our commercial relationship with Uruguay is certainly different than our commercial relationship with CARICOM member countries. But thank you again, Jan, for the invitation, and to all of you for listening in. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Braden, and welcome to your new role in the region. I'm really glad to say, and I hope this webinar also advanced the increased discussions with you and Ambassador McCook, so we can really get some things cooking in this region with the US and continue this discussion moving forward. I think we're going to get some, I hope, some very, but not necessarily controversial, but thought-provoking ways of the way we've done things and how we should do things from both Andrea and David. So without further ado, Andrea, over to you. And then David, you can just jump right in after.
All right, thank you, Jan. I hope everyone can hear me okay. All right, good. So, all right, first of all, thanks to the SRC, to the Embassy of Barbados for providing this forum, as well as for the support in that has allowed me to delve into the issue that Jan mentioned, which focused on private sector, CARICOM private sector engagement in US-CARICOM trade relations. And that is going to be the area that I'm going to focus on in my brief remarks. I'm not going to take on the issue of offensive versus defensive negotiating. I will leave that to Dr. McCook. Sorry, Ambassador McCook. I know you didn't want your title there, but I'm not privy to enough information. But what I do say is that I believe the success achieved by Uruguay in its trading relations with the US, as well as Costa Rica, are not at all beyond the capability of CARICOM countries. I took a look at the site that size is, I think size does provide some information, some important context. There is a site that shows the population of the country live, worldometer. And on August 26th, so a little over a week ago when I checked the site, Uruguay's population was just under 3.5 million. Jamaica's population today is just under 3 million. So a difference of just over 500,000. And of course, Jamaica is just one country in CARICOM. The population of just the English-speaking CARICOM alone exceeds that of Uruguay. So I do believe that success is the type of success that Uruguay has achieved is important, is possible. And in understanding how these successes might be attributed to the TIFA and the TIC, particularly in the CARICOM context, I was looking for information on two particular issues: the mechanisms of the TIFA-TIC process and the role of the Uruguay private sector, both of which were touched on. And as part of our role, I think we were asked to provide feedback that could be used by the authors of the paper as well. I would love to see more information in that area. Specifically, in terms of the mechanisms, I saw that work plans were developed very early in the US-Uruguay TIFA-TIC process, and they were updated on an ongoing basis. And that is whether you're going to call it offensive or defensive, nevertheless, it meant that the US would then not be the only one driving the process, which has been my observation of one of the weaknesses of the US-CARICOM TIFA-TIC process. When you look at the reports, they are used, forgive me, Ambassador Young very often uses an opportunity for the US to beat upon CARICOM with things that they should have done, ought to have done, etc. I think work plans provide specific and focus-driven agenda items that help to keep discussions on task and help to provide a check against which progress can be assessed. US-Uruguay TIC meetings were held annually until 2014. This is the second mechanism. And after that, more or less every other year. In fact, there was only the COVID pandemic that intervened. And I did see that the 9th TIC meeting was held in 2021 virtually, August of 2021. Another important mechanism, bilateral technical meetings, for instance, on sanitary, phytosanitary issues through the Bilateral Consultative Committee on Committee. And then in the area of services, there were a number of educational and scientific exchanges that I'm sure would have played a really important role in helping each country to understand each other's services sectors, opportunities and challenges, for example. And then in the context of the role of the private sector, the paper and the speaker, Angelica, spoke about this. They talked about associations that represented the sectors of the economy: Chamber of Industry, National Chamber of Commerce and Services, Rural Association of Uruguay, and these 11 sectoral commissions that were created, which contributed their analysis of each sector, status quo, and opportunities that could be pursued under a framework agreement. And the paper does a great job of highlighting the important role of the private sector. I'm going to turn to another TIC that I looked at, which is the US-Ecuador TIC, which was reactivated in 2018, much larger country population, etc. But they, again, immediately established 6 working groups to inform the work of the parties. And out of that came a couple of protocols, one focused on the role of the SMEs, and then another protocol on trade rules and transparency, which comprised 4 annexes covering trade facilitation, good regulatory practices, anti-corruption, and small and medium-sized enterprises. One of the things that came out of that process is the agreement to create a free, publicly accessible website to provide information that the parties consider useful to persons interested in trading and investing and doing business in each other's territories. Customs regulations, procedures, inquiry points, regulations or procedures concerning intellectual property rights, technical regulations, sanitary and phytosanitary measures relating to importation or exportation. In the paper that I worked on, I did a number of consultations with a number of private sector groups, and the lack of ability to access information on a readily accessible basis was one of the things that the private sector brought up. An outcome such as this, implementation of this type of commitment with the between US and Ecuador, is very possible in the context of a US-CARICOM TIC. And so my question would be, how do you achieve these detailed types of goals? How do you identify them? How do you explore them without the active participation of the private sector? And in the case of the private sector across CARICOM, they have not been aware of the US-CARICOM TIC. My sense is that they have not been invited to participate, and that this is something that very, very much needs to change. So turning back to the paper, I think it would be very, very helpful in terms of lessons for CARICOM if the paper incorporated some more discussions around how Uruguay was able to successfully integrate the private sector and its findings into what very often is a state-led process, a state-to-state discussion, which is something that very much needs to change. I could go on. Do I have a little bit more time?
I think you have us glued to this paper, and I know you did a lot of background research. I'll give you 2 minutes if David doesn't mind. Us a slight incursion, and I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So if you can do it in 2 minutes, your paper will be circulated.
I can. Okay. All right. So I do want to point out, and maybe this is something that will catch David's attention too. There was a reference to Uruguay having been able to export architectural and engineering services in large numbers to the US. This is definitely something that's of interest to CARICOM. And if the TIFA was used to overcome such issues as portability of qualifications and the challenges around state-based certifications, state-based professional certifications in the US, it would be very, very useful, I think, to CARICOM to get some insights into how this was done. And then, so yes, I think that was the main additional point. I just want to end by endorsing the final key recommendation of the paper to CARICOM, which is that each country or region has to find its way. And this was, of course, recognized by Ambassador McCook as well, that there is no tailor-made recipe for success. The private sector, however, plays an integral role in helping each country to figure out where are these areas of competitive advantage, where are the new areas that can be explored. And so it's going to be very important for CARICOM to incorporate the private sector into the TIFA TIC discussions with the US. Thank you. I will stop there.
Wow, Andrea, that was, if there was any sort of doubt about the value of the work that trade consultants, again, a clap is going up, do in interrogating and being able to assist sort of the governmental and regional processes. I think you've demonstrated it. I know your paper is a great one. We're holding it back and get people's appetite for it. I'm really, really excited about your perspectives as well. And I think the lesson to learn is that in addition to the private sector excitement, there's a really important process-related component that has to be integrated into all of these negotiations, not tailor-made not a one-size-fits-all, but tailor-made to the specifics of the relationship that we're trying to build. And I think the examples you draw, without generalizing them necessarily, but giving us a tool from which CARICOM can work towards our own path, it were excellent insights. So again, a stellar performance. All of our speakers have been really wonderful. Over to you, David, and I'll give you until 11:50, I think, or 52, and then we'll try and get to the questions which are already sort of lining up here. Over to you, David.
Wonderful, Jenny. Thank you. And I'll try to be quick and brief and to the point. Braden Young at USTR, welcome aboard to the Caribbean Circle of Trade Discussions. Your experience in Mexico, I think, will serve you very well, particularly because we need to remember that Mexico has always had a very strong relationship with the Caribbean, not only in trade areas, but others. So welcome aboard. Anna and Angelica, thank you so much for this work. I'm really happy that we were able to reach out to you and get the engagement for this discussion on Uruguay as an example, not necessarily a model or anything, but an example of a small open economy that can take a very proactive agenda on trade, both at their regional level and the international level, which has a lot of similarities with the CARICOM region, both in terms as the grouping, but also individual member states engaged in the trade and investment agenda. Thank you again, Ambassador McCook, for joining us today. Congratulations again on the appointment. We had been looking forward to this, and Janive and I are very happy that we've been able to secure everybody on board, as well as my colleague Andrea Ewart from the Caribbean Policy Consortium, and a fellow in the vineyard of these trade discussions between the US and CARICOM. First of all, full disclosure, it was way back in 2008, brainstorming at the office of the USTR with then Assistant USTR for the Americas, Everett Einzestad, who in the late 1980s happened to have been an intern at Manchester Trade while he was doing a law degree, and then of course served as the senior trade counsel for Chairman Grassley of the Senate Trade Finance Committee, that we started brainstorming on what Uruguay was doing, and maybe there were things there that CARICOM could also pick up and learn from. And particularly way back then, we started talking already about the importance of services dominating Uruguay's economy and dominating CARICOM economies, and how to use that as a point of leverage beyond the CBI, which was a goods-based trade preference agreement. So full disclosure to Everett and the work he had done as USTR. Second full disclosure is that as a firm, we've been working for many years, both with colleagues in Uruguay, in Ecuador, and then in Kenya, in terms of how do you move beyond preferences with the US to something that is much more substantive in trade and investment. And of course, the work on services has been one of those areas, and looking at the competitive and comparative advantages of services within the realm of trade and investment. So I think that's really very important in terms of what I had called from the beginning, the advantage of a TIFA and a TIC to really delve deeper and broader into the trade and investment collaboration with the United States, with as many of the benefits of a free trade agreement like other countries have had, with none of the political costs or the political baggage that it implies, which is heavy, as Annabelle had mentioned. And I think that's maybe one of the key points in terms of the Uruguay example, because of the limitations Uruguay has as a member of Mercosur to negotiate a full-fledged bilateral free trade agreement, very similar to the case of the Caribbean community. So in that sense, it's something to bear in mind and see how that has been leveraged, and particularly, as we heard from the paper, in the area of services, in the area of electronic commerce, in the area of B2B, which are now so very strong for the CARICOM member states and their trade and investment relationship with the United States. Particularly also, I think it's important that the fact that we may not be as aggressive or more defensive on a free trade agreement front is not necessarily a disadvantage, because as we are seeing now, and I think as Braden pointed out in terms of the USTR and the Biden administration's trade agenda with the rest of the world, we're talking about a much more inclusive format of engagement. And I think that's what opens the door for the work that Andrea is doing with regards to the private sector. But I would say writ large, civil society as a whole, much more than only the private sector. And what we are seeing, particularly in the recent cases of Ecuador and the case of Kenya, as well as the discussion with Uruguay, is that it's not only the integration and the involvement of private sector actors, but also civil society writ large in other areas of trade, whether it be labor, environment, gender rights, indigenous rights in many countries, and so on, and the role that these play in terms of the trade agenda with the United States. Just like we've always discussed that war is too important to be left only to the generals. Well, whether we like it or not, trade is too important to be left only to the trade experts. So there's a balance there to be played. And I think at the end of the day, the crux of the matter really, and we've been working on this since 2014 when we launched the Services of the Caribbean Initiative, SOCA, with the Caribbean private sector, is how do we get the private sector to be organizationally sitting at the table with the CARICOM governments for these discussions of the TIC under the TIFA arrangements. And again, there's mechanisms for this. As a matter of fact, since those discussions in 2008, the US position has always been to welcome private sector engagement, but at the same time that it has to be from both sides. They cannot force it on the other side. And frankly, the feedback over those years since 2008 has been that we need CARICOM to be in agreement with that. We are ready, because those of us who are in the private sector in the US know that we have an entire governmental, regulatory, and legally based structure for private sector and civil society involvement in all US trade and investment agendas at the global level, industry advisory committees, discussion groups, mechanisms for integration, but it has to be from both sides. So at the end of the day, and I know as discussions are ongoing for the next meeting of the TIC and to re-engage, as has been discussed since the June 2019 meeting, I think the question and the key issue is, how can we establish that mechanism for private sector involvement in the region, both at the chamber level, at the Caribbean private sector organizational level, but then also specifically industry and sector level in different areas, agribusiness, services, technology, telecommunications, educational services, to bring in and leverage what the TIFA and what the TIC have to offer, and how to take that to the next level. And if you will, not so much the natural progression, but what has been called in the trade parlance, the graduation beyond the strict goods-centered unilateral trade preferences to something that is much more inclusive. And indeed, I'm glad that people mentioned the Ecuador experience, because what Ecuador is discussing right now with the US in terms of their TIC and engagement also opens the door for some of these new initiatives. So let me stop there, Andrea, and open up for our Q&A. And again, thank everybody for the involvement. I know it took us some time to get this webinar together, but I'm really happy that we've been able to do it. And there's a lot of food for thought and for action into the future. So thank you very much.
And thank you, my co-host, David, for your wonderful sort of umbrella remarks. I'm going to go, which again are eliciting these spontaneous clapping of hands. This is the first webinar I've been on where every single speaker gets claps of hands. So I think that's a sort of endorsement enough of this initiative and what we're getting out of it. Let me just go to the questions, and we have 10 minutes left. And what I'm going to do is kind of try to bunch the questions together and give each speaker about 2 minutes to address whichever ones they feel are most capable within their kin of being answered effectively. So we have a number of questions about the private sector. I think one thing coming out of this webinar is how important, and we've heard this before, but the specific questions we have are, the CBI and TIC have been, consulted on for years. The private sector's involvement has been solicited. What next? What more can we do? Which mechanisms specifically did Costa Rica and Uruguay use to get the private sector on board with accessing these agreements? So these are questions really about how do we get the private sector on board, and how do we make it stick? How do we actually integrate them in the process so that they actually are able to influence the discussion? One set of questions. Another set of questions is, how do we plan to negotiate? Is it that we'll do it sovereign, as separate sovereigns, or collectively, as a group, as CARICOM, writ large, or do individual countries take the lead? Again, more general questions about meeting the challenge, CARICOM, meeting the challenge, and especially framing this within the context of this TIC discussion. How do we meet challenges on climate change and food security? Another question I have is about logistics. How does CARICOM perceive the current logistics situation affecting trade with the US, even if we have strong connections with the suppliers of goods and transportation services from Florida? I think I've kind of gauged every question more or less. And so I'm going to turn very quickly to the speakers to give their answers to that and sum up at 2 minutes each. I think I'll start maybe with you, Anna, and Angelica, if you wanted to respond to anything or anything you heard during the course of the discussion.
Thank you. Well, I have list some topics that I heard from David and also from Andrea that are quite interesting for me, also from the ambassador, that have relation also with the question about how the private sector was involved in the case of Uruguay to participate in this case of the study of a potential in first instance free trade agreement, and then in the TIFA. And really the point is that in general, the government in Uruguay, not only in that case, but always today we are managing the opportunity for a free trade agreement with China, and it's the same procedure we are having. So the government invites all the chambers, all the authorities, all the reference, all the real stakeholders of different sectors in order to receive their commitments, in order to receive the demands and a clear picture of each sector. So after that, the government have a meeting, an important meeting with the stakeholders in the representation of each sectors, identifying the strong points in the negotiation and the weak point in the negotiation in order to have alternatives or in order to define which ones are ready to go ahead with the agreement and which ones no. So it is a common use here. I mean, this was not an exemption with that moment, but I think that is a good space for exchanging different kind of opportunities, and we used to do in that way. Sometimes some sectors contact consultancies in order to receive more information about the context, about how deep this agreement could affect or could give the opportunity to grow for the sector. But that's the way in general that we as a country improve. Furthermore, of course, the government have the definition and take note of all the conclusions. Sometimes some of sectors receive bad news, or the decisions are not in the sense they propose. But anyway, the idea is to, you have the opportunity to talk now. Not then when we have signed the agreement and nobody said nothing, so you there say, okay, this is not good for me because I'm losing market share or whatever. The moment you have as a sector to express your idea, your difficulties for this agreement is in the previous, in the workplace when you analyze and study the case, and then we have the opportunity, different sectors that have the opportunity to show information, and then you have also the meeting with that ministry or whatever the government define. I just one idea more.
Oh yes, half a minute.
One idea, just in order with Andrea comments and also the ambassador, of course, talking about the asymmetries and about the size of the countries and the population, maybe in that moment, if Uruguay visualize the opportunity for all the Mercosur, that, as Andrea said, we are as a country, we have 3.5 million, but of course, if we in that moment visualize Mercosur were 300 million, that maybe would be different for a negotiation like this. Of course, we were afraid, we were new, we were a child of 10 years of integration, so things go in a different way. That's why we understand that we lose the train with the free trade agreement. And when we decide, okay, go ahead, how can we do this? United States said, no, stop here. We would like to go to a TIFA. And of course, Uruguay said, come on, let's go with a TIFA. CARICOM has around 44 million of population, so it's quite different, really.
Yeah, even smaller than that, it's more 14. If you just look at the CARICOM member states. I know, Braden, you have your hand up, and I know Ambassador, like myself, have to leave. So I wonder if it's okay if I ask Ambassador McCook to go before you. And kind of give his 1 minute now. We've gone down to 1 minute summation. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thanks. I think we have to address the myth of private sector exclusion. I don't know of any public sector negotiator who can approach a bilateral engagement without consulting with its stakeholders. I know certainly in past experience at national level, all positions were driven by engagement in what was called a trade adjustment team, a mature and incisive consultative engagement with the private sector. The outcomes of that consultation are probably what we need to focus on. What it is that the private sector tells the negotiators at the national and community level to do. That's a discussion for another time. Thank you.
That's important. Because I often hear from government as well as a regional organization personnel that they have engaged the private sector. That there's some disconnect that's happening, obviously, because we're hearing from the private sector that somehow that's not translating necessarily into a continuous relationship, mutually advanced. But I think that's
could I try to address that? That would be my final point. So could I just.
I hope just because of the queue, Braden, did you have to run off as well before I?
Oh no,
go ahead, Andrea, and then Braden, and then David, and we bring everything to a close.
All right. Perhaps what I can try to say is that the TIFA is not a negotiation. You know, I mean, the TIFA has been negotiated, it's been concluded. What the TIFA provides and the TIC is an ongoing mechanism or an ongoing platform to address, you know, to improve trading and bilateral investment relations. And so I think it requires a different approach from that of an all-scale negotiation where you go and you do this, you know, the consultations and so on. Those do happen at the level of CARICOM, and there's no one who says that they do not. What we need to do is to find another approach that will allow them to build on the opportunities that the TIC platform provides, perhaps by focusing on one issue at a time, or is it two issues at a time? But I think that may be the area of disagreement or disconnect. And that would be my one suggestion that I would make in order to help to move beyond that. Thank you.
Excellent, very tangible. Thank you. Braden, to you.
Great, thank you. And I'll be quick, just a couple quick thoughts. So on stakeholder engagement, yes, certainly we really value stakeholder engagement, consider it, engagement with stakeholders, including with the private sector, a very, very important part of the process. I also wanted to underscore, we appreciate that countries in the Caribbean have different concerns, interests, needs, and levels of development. We understand the Caribbean region is not a monolith, and our engagement needs to reflect this. And in practice, this can mean engaging bilaterally with individual countries on specific topics, or addressing other topics in regional groups. And such bilateral or small group meetings can help us formulate a constructive agenda for our regional CARICOM TIFA. Thanks.
Excellent as well. Thank you so much. And the last word is with you, David.
Very quickly, thank you all again. I think it's amazing with the post-Summit of the Americas engagements that have been advanced, the US and CARICOM level. The timing is really critical now, because I think the environment, the ecosystem is primed on both sides to really advance on deeper and broader engagement. At the level of the TIC, and particularly from the experiences, as I mentioned, with others, it really becomes very, very simple to just, within a 1-2 day format of a TIC agenda meeting, there is maybe a 1-2 hour session which includes the private sector of both sides, and that's it. It's very simple. One side may have more structured mechanisms for that involvement, like in the case of the United States. Braden has to follow it because it's the law of the land. And if a private company like Manchester Trade has a complaint, Braden has a problem because it's the law of the land. In the case of CARICOM, it's not law, it's much more policy directed, but it can be established, and it's very simple. In the past discussions we've had, there've been concerns from government sort of thinking that what this means is that the private sector is going to be there 24/7 in all of the, no, of course not. That's not what it is. It means that if you have a 1 hour session discussing B2B, electronic commerce and services engagement in the US market, which is one of the questions asked on the format, and that's an area where we do need policy and transactional help, then let's just bring them in. The US will have a group of private sector people they've invited. The CARICOM side can have it, and you begin to engage in those discussions in a very simple manner, because otherwise you are involved in the process, but you're not part of the process. And I think the discussion of outreach and stakeholder involvement is, do we have a seat at the table to express our interests and our needs? And then what happens, and the Uruguay case proves it very well, is business groups then go and do their stuff on their own. We don't need governments to do deals. Thank you very much, governments. All we need is, can we get a seat at the table? And then we'll identify where we can invest, produce, and trade, because with all due respect, governments do not do any of those three things. Businesses do that. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much.
I have to let the last word now go to Ambassador McCook, but excellent, again, intervention. Ambassador McCook, you know we need to end it, so quickly.
Yeah. No, I think probably what this triggers is a conversation about efficacy. Because when I said, Andrea, there's no exclusion, that is identifying what is. It's different what one would want. I envy negotiators, and I treat even non-binding engagements as negotiations. We use the same sort of approach. As how do you become more effective? You can only be more effective in trade consultations or negotiations if you know what you want. You can only know what you want if those who are going to use what you deliver inform what you seek. It's a little bit philosophical, but I think it's very simple. For colleagues who negotiate like Braden with the private sector in the room, and I've been in negotiators where CARICOM has had the private sector teams in the national delegations in the same forum. So it's not all of these things are part of the ecosystem. What we have not yet found, I think, is the most efficacious way of using that to deliver outcomes that benefit. And I look forward David and Andrea, to the thoughts you have on efficacy, not access, efficacy. Thank you.
Excellent. And I think if there were one negotiation or potential negotiation to act as a sort of a model, maybe we could really use the TIFA to kind of generate the thinking, the input. Look at the people we have on this call and the people in the audience. I think it would be great, and it would really reap a lot of benefits for all the spheres of negotiations we're involved in, not just this one with the US, but the huge space of negotiations of different types and of different interests and levels of ambition that CARICOM is involved in. Let me just bring this all to a close by first and foremost thanking the US Embassy for believing in the SRC's attempt to bring this kind of negotiation to the front and endorsing the model of a paper informing a discussion and ultimately having something tangible that we hope to put into a grand white paper. And I have one of our interns here that we will distribute and help CARICOM and its negotiations and member states. Let me also thank the CPC and David for his not just the institutional, but his personal interest in these webinars and really getting at the right people for the job. I also want to thank our speakers who gave so much thinking and intellectual provocation in their remarks and great research. And I really look forward to us circulating the paper from this, as well as all of our webinars. And we anticipate Andrea's final paper, which I think we have received, that we will distribute and provide a forum and a platform to discuss it. Let me also thank our team here at the SRC and at the University of the West Indies, as always, for tuning up and doing a great job. And also let me thank you, the audience. We often find attrition towards the end of these discussions, and we are very happy that we're seeing the numbers remain. Let me use the opportunity finally to promote the work that we are doing unashamedly at the SRC to bring trade and trade thinking to the fore. Please visit our website at sridathrampalcenter.com. We have a dedicated space that we'll be creating for US-CARICOM initiatives. And we also have revamped our website so that you can find better and easier access to our information of the team, the research team, as well as the admin team. We've been working very hard to get our information out. And let me also announce that we will be having, and we have been organizing, the second Distinguished Owen Arthur Memorial lecture featuring Dr. Carla Barnett, talking about reimagining CARICOM in tribute to the past Prime Minister of Barbados, Owen Arthur, who has led a lot of the thinking in the region in terms of industrial policy and regional integration. That will be on UETV. On Monday, it's happening, and so stay tuned. Let me thank you all, and let me encourage you to also support the Africa Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. That's going to be that is being broadcast live on YouTube, and you may see Ambassador McCook and myself at a session at 3:25 talking about the scope for Caribbean African free trade advancement in these relations. So without further ado, thank you to my panel. Thank you very much to DDG Annabelle, who left, and in her absence, thank her for also heading off this discussion in a wonderful way. Look out for the paper. It's going to be distributed by Angelica and Anna, and look out for the recording of this webinar on our website, sridathrampalcenter.com. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a wonderful day and weekend. Have a great one. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. All the best.